All right, Gary Edgington, I really appreciate it. I saw you online. I saw some other interviews you had done. I think your people pull to have you come on their shows. The whole FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force,
Right.
background, law enforcement, and stuff. My show is obviously mostly military guys. I've had some law enforcement specific people on. I've actually had one other FBI agent on, and it's an interesting world, law enforcement, right? Because you are the only people in our society that can like detain people, like lock people up against their kind of will, like legally
Hmm.
you're allowed to do that. But at the same time, it's a necessary, it's like a
Right.
necessary kind of thing that happens. And I don't know, it's just such a weird world to live in. The dangers, we talk about military people coming back from combat and having PTSD and having issues and stuff like that. But law enforcement people don't ever get that, like coming back and getting that break and then going back out a year later or whatever. It's like an everyday thing. And not every day is a firefight or anything crazy, but
Right.
over a 20-year career, I can see how that stuff adds up. So I really would like to talk about that stuff as well. But let's start at the beginning, man.
Sure.
I understand your father was a police officer. Or were there other members in your family that were in law enforcement as well?
Well, a long, long time ago, back in the 1850s, my great-great-grandfather was the sheriff of some county in Illinois. And my grandfather was a posse member in Colorado, but my dad was really the only, other law enforcement officer to speak of. Now, I have a cousin who just retired from the Orange County Sheriff's Department. He was a lieutenant, but that's really about it. We're the only black sheep in the family. The rest, I come from a family of farmers and miners, basically. On my mom's side, miners. On my dad's side, farmers.
That's an
So,
interesting background, man. The mining, and are you from California originally, or?
born and raised in California, but it's the Irish ancestors on my mom's mother's side. Fresh off the boat Irishmen, enlist in the Union Army during the Civil War, move out west, become miners, work in the mines in Colorado and different places, and was wounded. We talked about history there. I actually have stood on the spot where his regiment stood, Ninth Massachusetts Volunteers at the Battle of Malvern Hill. It's in Virginia, just outside of Richmond, during the Peninsula Campaign that was commanded by George McClellan, and he was wounded twice, standing on the line there at Malvern Hill. And a buddy of mine's, whose great grandfather was with the 13th Pennsylvania, was in the line in front of my grandfather. We were talking about it, and he said, "Yeah, I had somebody at Malvern Hill too." But it was really cool to stand on the very spot where that happened.
That's
You
wild,
know,
man. That's such
yeah.
an interesting like family. So you're saying they came over to the U.S. and almost immediately joined the military or joined the
Well,
Union
what
Army, or?
Well, the potato famine in the 1840s, all these Irish people moved over, and they settled in, the Good family is the last name, Goode, settled in Roxbury, Massachusetts, which is part of Boston now, and then that was probably in the early 1850s, and then in 1862 or 61, he enlisted in the Ninth Massachusetts and was wounded in 1862 at Malvern Hill, and was invalided out. He ended up getting married and then moving to Colorado, and
Started
then
mining.
started mining.
That's
Yeah,
old school, old west stuff. Being a miner
oh
at right
oh
after
yeah
the Civil War.
oh yeah oh yeah. I've been to those towns where they lived in Black Hawk and Leadville and all these places, and this is the 1870s. This is the time of Hickok and the Earps,
Mm-hmm.
and all of this. I mean, this is a rough and woolly time back then. My great grandfather, I think, if I get these greats all straight, was born in Leadville, Colorado in 1876. So, it's
That's
kind of
awesome.
cool.
No,
Yeah,
it's super cool, man. That's
it
super
is.
cool. I love that old history, that old Americana. Like,
Yeah.
when I used to hike a lot more before my dog got older, and
Uh-huh.
now that he's passed away, I'll probably get out and start hiking more. But when you're out hiking out here in Southern California, it's not uncommon to be in an area where old mines are. There's
Yep.
like remnants of old mines, old mining towns, and stuff like
Yep.
that. These ghost towns. I mean, there's a guy who has a YouTube channel. I think he bought the mine called El Choro Gordo or something like that, or something like
Mm-hmm.
that.
Mm-hmm.
It's near Death Valley, but it's up in the mountains.
Mm-hmm.
And he's turned it into a YouTube channel where he's just taken this like ghost town, mining town, and he's redoing it all by
Oh,
him
how
and his
cool.
buddies. Yeah, and I think he's been doing it since like the beginning of the pandemic, and I think at some point he's gonna start hosting people up there for like an Airbnb and stuff. But like, there's one thing that was really cool. They have the dynamite closet dug into the side of the
Yeah.
mountain. It's just like cave kind of with a big steel door. They turned it
Yep.
into a library and everything. I'm like, dude, that is so just that kind of. But getting back to like, they find all this like historical stuff and everything. It's such an interesting time period. And, those are
It is fascinating.
wild people. Imagine the people nowadays are so hesitant to move out of their own towns or move. And you have so much information about anywhere you'd ever want to go. And back then it was like word of mouth. Maybe something's written down in a newspaper that's the most general of descriptions of an area.
Yeah.
And they're like, oh, let's do it. Let's go for it.
No, it is. And we have no understanding of what life was really like on the frontier back in the 18th century and the 17th century. I have ancestors that came over in the 1630s and settled in Maryland and were part of the original colony in Maryland. And I mean, that's like, that's serious stuff, back in those days,
For
you
sure.
know, I mean, they came over, and they had very little and they just had to figure it out,
Yeah.
and hope that the Indians didn't kill them in the process, or disease or starvation or God knows what else. If you go to Jamestown, it's quite sobering to see, how difficult life was then,
Yeah. We can't even imagine,
It's really true.
it's I don't know. It's crazy. It's cool though. I'm all about American history and people. I remember going to I think we were talking before we jumped on. I went to SDSU, and I remember talking to this girl while I was there in one of my classes, and she was saying, I was in Italian class. I was taking Italian, and she's like, "Oh, America has no culture." Blah blah blah. And I'm like, "What are you talking about?" I'm like, "Quit listening to people that tell you that shit." I was like, "The United States has so much culture. We have culture that we've created ourselves. We have culture from other places that have been brought here and kind of woven into local cultures." I'm like, the country is so huge and so vast, and there's so many differences between people, dialects, food, just everything. It just makes me sad that when I hear someone say something like that, it's like, get out and see your country because it's an amazing place.
I could not agree more.
Yeah.
I could not agree more.
So back to you, man. What brought you, along to being in law enforcement? What was that driving factor? Was it because your dad was doing it?
Yes. I started getting drawn to it in high school, and I joined a police explorer post attached to the Culver City Police Department, and went to a training academy that the Sheriff's Department did for police explorers, kind of like cadets, but sort of like, it's affiliated with the Boy Scouts of America. There's like the Sea Scouts and whatever, all that stuff, Devil Dogs, kind of, all those things, and so did that. I started that in the fall of 1974. And graduated high school in 75, and then in 76, I got hired on as a community service officer, which is a paid employee, civilian employee at the police department, and got a chance to work in detectives and in operations and patrol and in administrative functions, and so I kind of got a chance to see how a small police department operates. There were about 65, 70 sworn back then. Sworn meaning number of sworn officers, not all total employees, but just sworn officers. And then ultimately I was hired by Manhattan Beach PD in 79 as a police officer, and as we were talking about my father, and I was in the third week of the academy. My dad was uh, um, an officer with the LA County Harbor Patrol in Marina Del Rey. I'm sure you've been to Marina Del Rey, or you're familiar with it. He was actually retired Coast Guard. He was an E8 in the Coast Guard, went in 42, was all over the Pacific, got out in 64, and went to work for the Harbor Patrol. And on that day, on September 30th, 1979, he was attacked by an individual armed with a buck knife, which is basically a 3-inch bladed, folding knife, while he was in the process of getting off of his motorcycle. And he engaged the suspect and got one shot into him, but the suspect was way too close, about 8 or 10 feet away when he got the shot off, and the suspect didn't even break stride. The round impacted the guy's left hip and split into two. It was a 38 Special Core Lock plus P 125 grain. Blech. And so the round split in two. For one half exited out the abdomen of the suspect, and the other one lodged in the hip. But he jumped on my father. My father was not wearing a vest, because a lot of officers didn't wear vests back then. I doubt anybody on the Harbor Patrol did, and stabbed him in the chest, and then cut his right carotid artery, and and then eviscerated him basically. Yeah. And then he picked up my dad's gun, and this happened. For those in your audience who may be familiar with the area, this happened right where the valet parking station is at the Cheesecake Factory in Marina Del Rey, and the suspect ran through the cabanas at the little kiddie beach there, and he emptied my dad's gun, emptied the shells out of the gun, and then came around a corner, and where there now is the Jamaica Bay Hotel, there was a business called Yankee Peddler that rented bicycles. Somebody picked up the microphone on my dad's bike and broadcast officer down, officer needs help. So I just got chills just thinking about that just now, But anyway, the two responding deputies in two separate cars confronted the suspect at the Yankee Peddler, and he slashed at them with a knife. They saw he had what they presumed to be a police officer's gun in his waistband, because it was a 4-inch Model 15 Smith & Wesson revolver with Packmeyer grips, which was pretty much standard equipment back in the 70s for police officers. And they popped a couple shots off at him and missed him, and then they chased him across the street to where now is a Marriott hotel, but back then was a vacant lot, and they gauged him as he was fleeing and dropped him, and he assumed room temperature.
Yeah, good. That's fuck, man. That's I mean, in a moment like that, does that harden your resolve to want to become a police officer, or does it make you question, like, do I really want to get into this?
I never hesitated in my resolve to continue, but it did definitely, obviously it had a tremendous impact in ways that I wasn't even aware of at the time, because nobody knew what the hell PTSD was back then, and nobody understood the lasting effects of something like that. I never had a proper chance. I mean, I'm in the academy. I'm in the third week of the academy. I took a week off, and I was back. After that, and for another 16 weeks of fun and games, and then right into patrol. And while I was riding with my field training officer, two different field training officers, I was confronted by what we call 5150s. Welfare and Institutions Code 5150 in California is basically people who are mentally disturbed, and armed with knives. That we had to deal with, and one in particular was very close to having to shoot this kid. My training officer said to me, he said, because we didn't have tasers back then. We had batons. I don't recall if we even had any kind of spray, CS, CN, pepper, anything. We had batons, we had flashlights, and we had our guns. And my training officer, Craig, a former Marine, by the way, Actually, maybe he was Anglico too. Now that I think about it, I think he was.
Is there an
Anyway,
Anglico community within your police department? We were talking off camera
right.
about.
Yeah, I think he was Anglico now that I think about it. Yeah,
Wow.
really a great graphic designer and artist in his own right also. But anyway, he looked at me, and I'll never forget this as long as I live. I'm standing there. I have my 45 in my hand, which is what I started carrying as soon as I graduated because, I'm a big, I'm a kind of a shooter myself, and I kind of believe in big bullets, breaking bones, and so that's why I switched to a 1911 45. I had it in my hand. I can still see it to this day. And he looks at me and he says, "Gary," he says, "if he comes around that hedge," and he's like 15 feet away from us, and we're on the side of the house, and he's standing there naked with a huge butcher knife in his hand. He says, "if he comes around," he says, "I'm going to throw this at him, his streamlight, to try and stop him. But if that doesn't work, it's up to you." And I'm going, "Oh, fuck. This really got real really fast, But
Wow.
that was my baptism of fire in that regard, and I got through it, but
That's tough,
that was
man. I
never
mean,
getting out.
knives scare me, man. That's like
Oh yeah, they
I
should.
I've seen a few videos. Unfortunately, I've researched a lot. I post a lot of news articles on my
Hmm.
Instagram channel, Former Action News, for those that want to check it out.
Hmm. I wrote it down.
I post a lot of news stories in the stories there, and in that, looking for stories, I come across some pretty horrible videos. And the worst ones are stabbing videos. And I just like, as soon as I see someone get stabbed in a video, I'm like, oh man, like I can't watch this, because
Yeah, it's
it's just
this.
such a deadly weapon that is under. I mean, people talk about guns and stuff like that, and guns, in their own right, are deadly weapons, obviously. But knives are also super deadly and kind of. I think you see younger people have them because of the access, but they also it's an easier weapon to like wield.
Hmm.
But I don't think people that are I don't think they understand the damage they're going to do. If you stab someone with even if you carry one for defense, and if you've never stabbed someone or seen someone get stabbed before like that or slashed, it's pretty bad. It can be really bad, obviously.
Oh yeah.
Just
And the fact of the matter is, you may have even seen videos or participated in training like this, but we would have training later in my career when actually people started paying attention to this, and we had training where an individual would be armed with a blue knife and you'd have a blue gun, and he'd be like 20 feet away from you, and you had to stop him, get a shot off before he cut you, and nobody could do it. Nobody could do it. Even if you had the gun in your hand, you still couldn't get a shot off quick enough before he was within slicing distance. And once that happens, you're going to get cut. There was no way my father, even if he had gotten the $1 million shot, in the central nervous system and dropped him, he still would have cut him. He was that close. And the knife was razor sharp. I had a buck folding hunter knife. I've had several of them over the years, and
mm-hmm.
they're razor sharp. And there's no question he would have caught him. And knives are nothing to mess with. They're very, very dangerous, and they scare me too. They
Yeah.
really do.
I mean, we just saw the other day there was in France. There was a knife
Oh
attack on
yeah,
that
that's Syrian
playground,
guy.
and
Exactly.
it's one of those things where you look at it and you're like, if you're in that situation, you have to act, right. There's these dude attacking kids on
Right.
a playground. That's almost harder to deal with that than someone with a gun. Almost, you know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
Like in some
Mm-hmm.
cases, it's just because I don't know. It's such a. I know I'm like tripping over my words here, but I'm flashbacking to these videos I've seen of people getting stabbed, and it's just horrific. I'm telling you, if you haven't seen them, don't go look them up because they are as bad as I'm saying, and there's just no need to see that kind of shit.
Right.
Unfortunately, when you're looking for news on the internet, you come across stuff like that. But
Right.
yeah, man, it's such a deadly technique for criminals or whatever.
No.
You said that you carried a 45. Your
Mm-hmm.
dad carried a 38. At that time, could you pick, whatever weapon, or was there like what service revolvers could you choose from?
Well, it depended on the department. Culver City went to 45s while I was there, and some guys still carried their wheel guns. But with the county, with the LA County Harbor Patrol, everybody carried the same weapon. For the most part, all of them were chambered in 38 special. They were all 6-shot revolvers, whether they were 6-inch or 5-inch or whatever, 2-inch. There were even a couple of guys that carried 2-inch revolvers. But with Manhattan Beach, I could carry a 45 there, and so as soon as I could get qualified on it, I did. I happened to have one, so I just took it out of the safe, and
do you guys shoot ball ammo with that, or did you guys have like
hollow point?
Hollow points. Okay.
Yeah. We didn't use. I never.
I almost said armor piercing. I'm like, wait, my military
never
brain.
Used. Right. No, I understand completely. I mean, when I was in Iraq, we were issued, 9mm ball ammo, which is basically only good for putting holes in Coca-Cola cans for the most part. But the 40 all police ammunition by then for the most part, except for probably LAPD, everybody else was carrying hollow points and or some kind of jacketed soft point. Mm-hmm. Not just a round nose, full metal jacketed bullet.
At that time, this was obviously before like the Hollywood like shootout, bank
mm-hmm.
robbery and all that stuff. Did anybody carry rifles in their patrol cars or any?
No.
Was there access
Shotgun.
to that? Just shotguns?
No, there were in the armories, but at Manhattan Beach we had shotguns in the cars, 870s, Remington model 870s with buckshot. Mm-hmm. At Beverly Hills, we had 870s with extended tubes and buckshot. And I think we had access to slugs also. But it wasn't until later, much later, that rifles, M4s and similar, started coming into. When I came on with the Department of Justice as a special agent, I carried an MP5, which is a really fun gun. I loved it a lot. I especially loved it because somebody else is buying the ammunition for it. Yeah. But that always helps when you're
for sure
when you're on rock and roll. But and then later on, I was issued. I carried an M4, and I did testing on it because I was a range staff guy, and I was able to show that in an urban environment, it was a much safer round as far as the danger of over-penetrating walls in buildings and things like that, because the 5.56 round, even the 55 grain jacketed full metal jacketed bullet would come apart inside the wall, and what would exit were fragments for the most part. Mm-hmm. Obviously not green tip, but 55 grain. But we issued 64 grain soft points, so that danger was even less likely. When he mentions the green tip, you're talking about the steel core that they started issuing. For better penetration. Exactly. Yeah.
That's so this was pre like SWAT and all that, right? Were there like special units that did a SWAT kind of mission that if someone had? Well, I mean, I guess let's start with this. Did you ever run into crimes with rifles, or I mean, how often did you run into crimes with rifles in this era? Before you guys even started carrying rifles of your own.
I cannot think of a single instance where I countered some. Oh, strike that. That's not true. We did have the only time I was ever actually shot at. What am I thinking? He had an M2 carbine. It was a crazy guy in Beverly Hills. Got a call of shots fired, which in Beverly Hills, 9 times out of 10 was probably a car backfiring or some other BS and not really the real deal. I can remember parking my car on Wilshire Boulevard and walking across, started getting out of the car, and I hear this pop, pop, pop. And I went, fuck, I guess this is real. Oh, shit. Grabbed the shotgun and ran across Wilshire Boulevard, jacked around in the chamber, and hid behind a palm tree. And the guy was up on the second floor of this house facing the street. I think it was on Hamilton, and popped a shot and it hit this metal wall right next to me, and I was like, whoa, shit. But I was way too far away to return fire because, I'm armed with a shotgun. I didn't have slugs, and I was probably carrying a 45 then, and it's too far. It was like 75, 80 feet, 90 feet away. There was no way I was going to effectively return fire. And so that guy ultimately got talked out. But when something like that would happen at these smaller agencies back then, they'd call LA Sheriff's SWAT to come out and handle the situation. And that's who responded, was LA County Sheriff SWAT.
Okay, so this wasn't before SWAT then.
No. Oh, no. LAPD had a SWAT team, obviously, going back, way back, and then Sheriff's Department also way back. Sheriff's Department's team was SEB, Special Enforcement Bureau, part of their Special Enforcement Bureau, and LAPD's was part of Metropolitan Division, and they're awesome. I mean, they're full-time SWAT dudes, like HRT or a unit that is training and running and gunning all the time, doing warrants, and so they're just like, they're a machine. Everybody knows everybody. You know how it is when you go in on a stack or whatever. Everybody, if you're with guys that you can tell by their body movements what's going on.
Sure.
If they freeze, something's not quite right, or they stiffen. All those little subtle things that come with everybody working together. And
I bet it's definitely a different level when you have a large agency like that can employ them full time in SWAT, whereas most agencies, that's an additional duty.
Exactly,
you keep your SWAT stuff. Duty. Yeah, you keep your SWAT stuff in the car, and if you get the call, throw the vest on.
And that's basically most agencies throughout the country, except for the bigger ones. That's the way they roll. But it's interesting now to see patrol rifles in cars now, M4s or whatever. In police cars. I think that's a good thing. And in the CHP, I'm sure you've seen it. The CHP rocks a shotgun and an M4 in every patrol car. That enables them to engage close in and far away. And I think that makes a lot of sense.
You really see them on the all the motorcycle patrol guys.
Exactly.
Because they have them mounted on the backside, they're like locked on there. I'm like, that's fucking cool.
And it's really interesting because I certainly never saw that when I only spent about 4 years in patrol. The rest of my career was in detectives, in investigations and stuff. So when I started seeing these guys, first it was shotguns. First you would see shotguns with folding stocks on bikes. And then they switched to the M4s. And it is surprising when you see it, but it actually makes a lot of sense. Motor officers are frequently, because of traffic, are frequently one of the first units to respond to an in-progress situation because they can cut through traffic quicker than a patrol unit can. So it makes a great deal of sense.
Yeah, it's an interesting tool. It's unfortunate that the reality is that they need those kind of weapons, but it is what it is. Being in law enforcement and, having been shot at by someone, shooting at you with a rifle and dealing with, I'm sure, handgun crime is way higher than rifle crime and stuff. Does that change your perspective on not the Second Amendment, but like who should own guns, or maybe there should be more? There's always this thing about there should be universal background checks, which in most cases there is, I can't.
That is true.
Yeah, you can't just go buy a gun. I think that's I don't know why people are confused about that, unless you go buy it in some places from like a buddy or something like that. But if you go to a store, there's a background check and everything. We can debate on how good that background check is, but do you think there should be different implementations for, ownership of firearms or any kind of changes? It's a tough question, and I don't want to put you on the spot like that.
It's a very tough question, and I, coming from California, where gun control has been incremental. It started out with just a tiny little thing, and now it's just every legislative session there's something new and more draconian than there was before, and that's sort of the way it is. That scares me. I'll tell you, as a law enforcement officer, for a hell of a long time, um, if they're really serious about controlling crime, then they need to get serious about prosecutions. They need to get serious about these progressive DAs who are not prosecuting cases that they should be prosecuting, including gun crimes.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, they scream and yell on one hand about controlling civilian access to firearms. On the other hand, they're not prosecuting cases involving guns, and there's so many instances, my father included, and I've known so many people. The individual who killed my father should have been in prison. He had been arrested a couple years before and went to court on a assault with a deadly weapon and attempt murder on a police officer, and he was armed with a rifle. He shot up his apartment in a lover's quarrel and got arrested. And he did 18 months in a Tuscadero State Mental Hospital and was released. And a few months later, he kills my father. Well, there's so many instances like this. The same people over and over again do this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
It's
an unfortunate reality that we're living in right now. Yeah,
it really is. And they gut gang task forces and the ability of gang units to interdict gang activities, and then they wonder why they have shootings involving gangsters. When you crack down on these people and lock them up, then they can't do their mischief.
Yeah,
it's very simple. If they kill each other in prison, who cares? It's the people out on the street we worry about, the innocents.
I'm with you, man. I think no new. Everybody starts talking about gun laws after a shooting happens and this and that. It's like, how is that law or what law are you proposing that would have altered, how this happened outside of gun confiscation, which is just not going to happen. That's just a non-starter in this country. There's just too many guns. The reality is that's just not going to happen. It's embedded in the culture. But I think you're 100% right. Everyone hears about gun crimes and stuff where so-and-so, the case was dropped, or, their sentence was like, massively cut, just because of overcrowding or whatever. It blows my mind. I'm with you on that. Why make new laws when we're not even enforcing the ones we have?
Well, that's it.
And the backwardsness. I read this today. It pissed me off, man. This isn't a gun thing, but it just talks about where our kind of mindset is. The Washington Times has an article out today. It says two DC firefighters were charged with assault Tuesday for the caught on camera attack of a man in April that police said started when the man punched a member of the fire crew. I read the article. These two firefighters were responding to a call. Some crazy guy came up and smacked, open hand hit one of the firefighters twice. And after the second time, they fought back. And now they're getting charged with assault. And at the very end of the article, it says the other guy's assault charges were dropped. And I'm like, what the fuck is happening right now? You got you got firefighters. Maybe there's more to the case that's not in the article, but you got firefighters that are responding to a call and they're being attacked, trying to do, while doing a civic duty, helping out the community, and they're the ones being charged. It's like, what kind of backwards world is that? And that's,
well, that's the world we live in right now, it seems. I'm not saying that abuses don't occur. They absolutely do occur. I worked internal affairs. I know that abuses occur. But, if you breed the aggressiveness, if you force police officers to be less aggressive, you're going to suffer the consequences, because effective law enforcement requires aggressiveness. Mm-hmm. I'm not talking about violating people's constitutional rights, but doing it the right way and the smart way, using the laws to your advantage in probable cause and arrest and search and seizure and all that other stuff. And the fact of the matter is, police officers now, and who can blame them, frequently are just kind of going from call to call like drones, because they're afraid to act, because if they do act and somebody beefs them, it's a disaster for their career. Promotions stop, transfers stop, everything stops until the beef is cleared, and beef being complaint. and that's just wrong. There has to be a middle ground.
Mm-hmm.
There has to be a middle ground, and anyway, so
No, I mean, that's kind of the point I was making at the beginning, where I said it's a fine line. It's a tough job because
mm-hmm.
you're violating people's constitutional rights by detaining them. It's but you're allowed to by law. You're the only people that are allowed to do that.
Right.
So it's a necessary thing that needs to happen. I don't think no sane person wants to get rid of the police, but people do want to see like the application of justice being fair, And
I couldn't agree more.
It's just
absolutely.
It's just such a tough time to dude. I have buddies that are police officers, and a couple of them are like, dude, I don't know if I'm gonna keep doing this. I'm gonna go over being a firefighter or whatever. Like, this isn't worth the stress.
That is so common now. I mean, it's just, and that's not good, because what we're going to get is the dregs, because we won't be able to hire anybody else. They got to put people in uniforms and get them out there. And we're not going to be hiring quality people that are motivated to do the right thing, that are motivated by public service and, protecting the people and things like that, sort of that sheepdog mentality. They're motivated by other reasons, which are not good.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's like the military's having problems with recruitment and retention. So is law enforcement. Huge problems with recruitment and retention.
Yeah, it's a lot of people are like, why do I want to be associated with this group that no longer holds the values that I also, hold, whatever.
Right.
Growing up as a kid, my dad was military, my grandparents were military and stuff like that. So for me, it wasn't a big jump or leap for me to join the military. It was just kind of like, I was really interested. I was fascinated by it as a kid. And it was like a call to service, and the first time I went to the recruiter's office was like the week September 11th happened, that I was a senior in high school and
mm-hmm.
stuff. And I don't know, I just felt like it was part of your duty is to kind of serve your country in some capacity, not necessarily military, but in some way,
mm-hmm.
Be a positive influence for your community and your country and stuff like that. And I think people like me that have that kind of mindset are becoming less and less, looking forward to a job or a career like that. When we see changes that we don't agree with, we see people, we see police officers that are fucking blasted. And
mm-hmm.
and turns out they did nothing wrong. We
mm-hmm.
prosecute people in the public eye rather than in the court of law. We don't let things come out and figure out, what really happened was this. Like I'm talking about these two firefighters. There could be something I don't even know about, and I'm just giving you the information that's out on the news right now. But the reality
mm-hmm.
could be completely different. Maybe they beat the crap out of the guy and they were bad, but I don't know. It's tough, man. I guess to kind of let's shift a little bit. You said you were with
Sure.
you did IA stuff.
Mm-hmm.
How often do you run into, when you were in IA, how often are you running into a bad cop? These bad apples. They exist in every society, every part of society. The zero defect mentality that we have for like members of the military or police officers or whatever. It's just ridiculous because they're psychos. And, when you have a group of thousands of people, there's going to be, outliers. There's going to be a psycho out there. There's going to be a child molester out there. It is what it is. It's an unfortunate part of reality, but it is. How often do you run into cases like that? Or when you were there, was the department doing a pretty good job of weeding those people out?
Well, I worked internal affairs with the Department of Justice, and I have to say that the quality of the people that I worked with was outstanding. Everybody that you couldn't walk in the door at the Department of Justice without already having been a very seasoned law enforcement officer, most of the time an investigator from another agency. So you have already kind of gone through a vetting process multiple times to get to that stage, not to mention a full vetting process with the Department of Justice. That being said, yes, you're right. There are bad apples, and there were bad apples in the Department of Justice. And, I had one particular investigation, which was, it could have been a lifelong case. It had nothing to do with abuse of authority in terms of hurting somebody or use of force or anything like that. It had to do with the mishandling of evidence and that kind of thing. so it was a fascinating thing. But one of the things about, and this, I think this holds true in any industry, um, that and you were an NCO, so you know what I'm talking about too. Um, when your troops fail, it's almost always can be traced to a lack of training or a lack of oversight.
Mm-hmm.
And occasionally you have somebody who has, snuck through the cracks, who's bad from the beginning, but a lot of times it's uh, corruption or misbehavior begins incrementally with small things, and then it gradually grows and grows and grows, and then finally they do something really bad. And so, you know, uh, that was something that, in so many instances, these investigations I was involved in were failures to properly supervise the individuals and ensure that they received the training and oversight that they needed to do the job.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's my opinion on it. That is a big part of it. For every failure there, because it's probably traceable back to a failure of administration and supervision too.
In the military, it's notoriously hard to get someone kicked out unless they've done,
Right.
Something crazy. Like if I've seen multiple people that have popped on drugs or whatever, done different things, and they're given, multiple chances, because it's a real headache, I think, for them to kick someone
Right.
out. But I think it's also not good. It's not a good look on the commander. It looks like as if the commander couldn't control this individual or whatever. So
Right.
they're not apt to do that. Is it like that in the police, within like law enforcement? Is it easy to be like, hey, this guy is no longer, I mean, because the military, it's a contract, so you have to do
Right.
what you can to keep the guy on to fulfill the contract. But it's not like that with law enforcement, right? Is it almost at will employment, basically?
Well, it depends on the agency. In California, it's a civil service it's not an at-will situation. But that's not to say that that investigations lead to terminations. I had one investigation that led to a termination, and I had one that actually I was able to exonerate the person who was accused, which I'm most proud of. So I think that the mechanisms are probably even more aggressive. Well, I shouldn't say probably. I am pretty damn well sure they're way more aggressive now than they were when I first started in my career.
Mm-hmm.
But almost to the point of being on a hair trigger. Like call 1-800. How are we doing? Kind of thing. I've heard stories about supervisors calling people who were moving citations by officers on his watch or her watch and asking them how the officer behaved. Well, most people are pretty pissed when they get a ticket. So what do you think they're going to say? They're
That's
not going
crazy.
to, occasionally, maybe, you're going to talk to somebody who, most of the people you talk to are probably going to say, well, he's very professional. He's okay. Everything's fine, whatever. But you're going to have that one person who will bitch about everything,
Mm-hmm.
who will say, oh my God, I hated his attitude. I didn't like the way he looked at me. He glared at me. He did this, he did that, blah, 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 blah. And before you know it, now you got an IA.
So they're seeking out complaints rather than just receiving them.
Yeah, basically, yeah.
That's a weird kind of.
Yeah. I've heard several stories about that. Thank God I've been out of it since, long since that had happened, but or after that or before that had happened. But it's still something that I think that is problematic, because that will once again breed complacency and a lack of aggression on the part of the police officers. Police officers did not act aggressively. I certainly don't know all the details of Uvalde. I've seen videos.
Yeah.
I've seen things. I've heard stories. I don't know all the details. But I believe there must have been a failure of leadership or aggression somewhere along the line for those officers to stand in the hallway while shots are being fired and not moving forward to the sound of the guns like we're all trained to do.
That video that came out of that is just crazy.
Yeah, it's crazy. And like I said, I don't know the details. I don't know, I have no idea. And so I'm not going to make a judgment. All I can do is just know, and then contrast that with other videos like the knucklehead, the female
In Nashville.
in Nashville. I mean, those officers moved, they shot, they moved, they aggressed her,
On
they took
point.
care of business, and canceled her ticket as quickly as they could. And that's the way these things need to be handled: quickly, efficiently, and hopefully with a toe tag, so we don't have to deal with the BS of a court trial.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you, man. I think aggressiveness in those situations for sure.
Mm-hmm.
I just so people are understanding that we're not trying to like make excuses for or let their bad cops should be prosecuted. Bad cops should be found out and removed from the force. People that are, you hear about some of these some of these different departments have issues. I think it wasn't in Atlanta, but it was in Georgia. There was a group of police officers that just got arrested for like beating a dude up. I think they ended up killing the guy. And when they reviewed the tape, it was like two officers are like holding the guy as one dude's like punching him and stuff. Yeah.
That was in Memphis.
Oh, was it Memphis? Is that what it was?
Yeah. Oh yeah. It was awful. It was unbelievable.
It was almost like a pseudo gang within the law enforcement. And
it was unbelievable. It was appalling. It made me sick when I watched it.
It's crazy how something like that can even occur. Like how you can get enough people to go along with that same kind of mindset. You know what I'm saying? Like, well, that's where I think people look at it and go, there's some kind of issue there, because to have 4 or 5 guys that are all like, yeah, this is okay. Like no one.
Well, where's the supervisor? Where's the field supervisor? Where was the field supervisor on the Floyd deal? I mean, there was no supervisor there. I mean, that's crazy. And that is a failure of administration, either to not have enough supervisors out there or whatever. But that is, I mean, those things. If a sergeant had rolled up on the scene on the George Floyd case and exerted their authority, they would have that would have ended in a completely different way. But instead, there was no supervisor. And the same thing with this Memphis deal. Mm-hmm. Where was the field supervisor? This was I think this was a pursuit and all kinds of things. Usually you have a supervisor respond to a scene on a pursuit. I think this was I think it was at the end of a pursuit, I think. And usually you have a field supervisor on scene on something like that. Well, where were they? How could they allow that to happen? I mean, those guys need to be locked up. If that's if what we see on the video is an accurate representation of what happened, those guys need to go to jail.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. What are your thoughts? What are your thoughts? So since you brought up the whole George Floyd thing, a couple of those cops that are in jail, that was like their first and second day on the job. They were like brand new. It was like their first week. They were, and was it Chauvin was like their FTO, I believe.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
That's a tough spot for those guys, right? Because I know as a new guy, I wasn't in law enforcement. I was in the Marines. But if I was a private or PFC and it's my first day on the job, I'm not questioning anything. I'm just kind of absorbing. You're
not going to walk up to the E5 or the E6 and say, "Hey, what you're doing is fucked up." You're not going to do that. You're not gonna walk up to your boss and say, "Hey, what you're doing is fucked up." I think one of the guys did say something,
mm-hmm.
but all these things hinge on what statements were made and what the details are, and I'm not privy to those things as far as what the actual details of the investigation were. But on their face, it's not reasonable to expect a rookie, a boot, who is riding with his FTO to intervene aggressively. Perhaps at a certain point, yes, and that maybe that was the rationale behind the prosecution, but certainly not initially. Because as a boot, you're standing there, your eyes are wide open all the time, and you don't know what the hell's going on. You've been through the academy. You don't really know how things happen on the street. Mm-hmm. You're learning it every second. And, so anyway, I think
it's such an interesting situation. I'm like, man, what a fucking shitty first week at a job. Bad.
Oh, yeah.
Wrong place, wrong time. You didn't get chosen. I mean, you didn't decide to go out with that dude or whatever. Like.
And that's the perilous aspect of law enforcement nowadays, that you can be you can be acting with an abundance of good faith and following all the rules and doing everything correctly, and show up at the wrong scene and get named in an indictment. And just because you happened to be there because you were ordered to be there, or you had a duty to be there. I mean, that has a chilling effect on law enforcement. If you think it doesn't, then you're drinking something funny, because it absolutely does. It would have a chilling effect on any industry. I mean,
yeah, if you're questioning every step, this next step could be
absolutely.
the end of my
Yeah,
career.
and
Yeah.
exactly. And questioning everything, as you well know, can get you killed and get your buddies killed. You know,
And being harassed for doing things that you were trained to do. It's like some of these
right,
things that
exactly.
people are in trouble for. It's like, that was the tactic I was taught. That's
Right.
the technique that we've identified as being legally sound and, able to implement on the scene,
Right.
kind of deal.
Well, along these lines, I'll share something with you on this, on my father's deal. I can tell you for certain, because we had a conversation that morning before he went to work. I had worked the night before at my police department, and so we talked about use of force. He was having breakfast. We talked about a case that was going on in LA involving LAPD, where they shot a female who was armed with a knife, and who had thrown the knife at them. And this was a big brouhaha in LA. The LA Times mischaracterized the nature of why the officers were there. They said they were there collecting on a gas company bill, and that's not true. They were there investigating an assault with a deadly weapon on a gas company employee, and all kinds of stuff. And so that was in the back of my dad's head that morning. And some witnesses said he hesitated a little bit before he drew his weapon. Whether he hesitated or he paused before he started to draw his weapon, another witness said. I am certain in my own mind, knowing my father, that he probably hesitated a little bit. He probably thought about that. He probably thought about the Eula Love case before he drew his weapon. And in that split second, that could have cost his life.
Yeah.
Because the old saying, hesitation kills. That is true. In a situation like that, hesitation does kill.
Yeah.
So
especially, close up, edge weapon, dude's charging you. You can't. Yeah. You have to just
so
react.
Close. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, man. So. It's kind of wild. I don't know. It's a weird world. What did you see when you went from community policing, being an officer out on the street and stuff, to working more in the federal realm? You went over to the Justice Department as a federal agent, or a special agent, excuse me. What did you see are the big differences between like local and state law enforcement compared to like federal?
Well, let me clarify one thing. I was a task force officer. I was a special deputy United States Marshal. We had cross designation on the task force, on the Joint Terrorism Task Force, but I was not an employee of the federal government. I was a state agent.
Okay.
And so anyway, it's bureaucracy.
Of course.
Assets and bureaucracy, something that I know you are intimately familiar with, having been exposed to the military myself in Iraq. It's astounding, the levels of bureaucracy in the military, and the higher up the food chain you go, the greater the bureaucracy, and the more complicated and the more complex and the more levels of oversight and bean counting and all this other stuff. When I went from local law enforcement to the state, yes, more oversight, more bean counting, a much I would say a much more clearly delineated policy and procedure kind of situation, where you have a lot of manuals, okay, and then when you work on the federal side with the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the bureaucracy of investigation, it is a very bureaucratic organization with a lot of oversight by people not necessarily intimately familiar with the details of investigations in the field, and I think that causes problems at some point in time in investigations, and they have on the other side of the coin, they have assets and abilities that local law enforcement can only dream of. When we would do search warrants on the task force, on the Joint Terrorism Task Force, they'd have 30 agents hitting a scene. When we would do search warrants on the state level, we had 4 or 5, 6 maybe. I mean, it's a question of assets, bringing assets to bear, and the federal government is, they print the money, so they have no shortage when it comes to that. And so I think that the quality of the personnel, I work with good and bad everywhere. I mean, I'm not saying bad people. I'm talking about
relatively speaking.
No, well, actually, that's a bad choice of words. Let me back up and say I worked with really top-notch investigators in every organization, from the FBI on down to other agencies besides the FBI that I worked with. I worked with a lot of different agencies. When we were counter-terrorism, we worked with a bunch of agencies, and I worked with the Secret Service. The hardest working people in law enforcement, I think, are Secret Service guys. They're unbelievable how hard that job is. I spent a week with them, and I was like, oh my God, how do you guys do this? But
that's funny.
And then you have the drones, and you have drones on every agency everywhere. The investigators or the agents who don't want to actually get out in the field and investigate, they sit at a computer and try to solve the case by a computer, and that really doesn't work out well. There's I don't know if you've ever watched Bosch, but on his computer there's a sign that says "Get your ass out and investigate," or something like that. Get out in the field and talk to people. Well, that's what you need to do when you're an investigator. You need to get out.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think nowadays you kind of have to be able to do both, with the increase of technology, right? Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Implement. Oh, yeah. Now we got AI and everything else. It's going to be a weird world for investigators when we start having it'll be hard for investigators when we start having videos and stuff that they're unable to detect if that video is made by AI or if it's a real video.
Yeah.
And it's that's not scary. That's not too far off.
That's really scary. That is really, really scary. And the tools now that are available now, we couldn't dream of it because we couldn't conceive of it back when I started out. Alpers, facial recognition, computer analysis that, all of these things that speed up the process that would take weeks and weeks and weeks can now be done in a matter of moments. Now
the pushback from people that are not necessarily as much pro police and stuff like that is that these facial analysis and all that stuff is, not constitutional. There's I'll let you go ahead and if you want to speak on that, how technologies make stuff more efficient, but also kick the line of what is constitutional and what's not.
Well, I think it goes back to, it all goes back to the mores of the agency and the principles of the agency employing the techniques. If they're doing it for the right purposes, and following the Constitution, all of these things can operate safely within the boundaries of the Constitution if they're employed correctly. Facial recognition software, all these things, but they have to be employed correctly within the framework of the Constitution and criminal law, and when that stops happening, and then that's when things get bad. But in 15, 20 years ago, there were abuses of what they called technology back then, but what now we would call, a rock and a string, but you know, evolution is constantly progressing. These things are constantly progressing, and old technologies are now, considered a ho hum. But back in the day, there were probably times when those were being abused too.
Mm-hmm.
I remember when I was a cadet at Culver City, we used to have we had to use a teletype to request a license plate. Okay, you've seen those in movies, old movies where you have this long strip with holes punched in it.
Mm-hmm.
You had to cut a tape every time you ran a license plate. And then when we finally got a CRT computer screen, oh my God, it was like the discovery of fire
Yeah.
by the Neanderthal. It was unbelievable, unbelievable. But because before then, it took a lot longer to get that information. Because you had to cut this thing, and if you didn't do it right, it would kick it back out. One small little tiny thing that was off, missing one space or one comma or something like that, boom, you'd have to do it all over again. You'd have to cut the tape all over again, and it could take a long time. And I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but in law enforcement, you're only allowed to hold somebody, for a traffic stop or whatever, for a reasonable point of time. A reasonable period of time. And what is that? Well, it depends on the circumstances.
Yeah.
But if you're scratching a ticket for going through a stop sign, but you're holding a guy there for 45 minutes because they can't run the license plate because the system isn't working right, that's going to be a problem.
Yeah.
So, and that could be an abuse.
Yeah. No, I get it. So you're also you're making it easier to do your job, but you're also making it easier for the citizen to go along their way if it's something as basic as a
potentially, yeah. I mean, it cuts both ways. It allows you to eliminate people who may not be eliminated previously. So, and it helps you potentially identify the really bad guys out there and take them off the street. So it cuts both ways.
It's a weird world, man. I saw like a couple months ago, there was it's an AI program or I think I don't know if it's an app or just a program, but it's a program where you can upload a picture of you or whatever, or someone taking a selfie photo, and the program geolocates it and finds you video from public video cameras around that area of you taking the selfie. It identifies where you took it, and then identifies cameras, and then it sends you the video of you taking it, or whoever. How crazy is that? That's
wow,
dude. We're living in another world right now. It's
That's true.
And I think so. Right now, obviously, there's a lot of I think with any federal law enforcement agency, politics are always going to be involved. It's just part of the bureaucratic system. Like the military, the people that move up into these senior positions are becoming less of what they were and more into like politicians and stuff. Mm-hmm. And that's partially you have to if you want your organization to get funding and the missions and whatever. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, some people get wrapped too much into their own politics. Have you seen a time where law enforcement agencies were being so criticized by both political spectrums? You know what I'm saying? Like right now, there's a lot of pushback against the FBI and stuff that they've done from the right. And then local law enforcement see a lot of pushback and stuff from the left. You know what I'm saying? It's like different areas that people are focused on, but everyone feels like that their side, if you will, is being overly prosecuted compared to the others or whatever.
And you know what, though? I mean, that goes back to the old saying, it depends on whose ox is being gored.
Yeah.
I mean, really, it always depends on,
Has it felt this political before, though?
I think it has been before. I think in the 60s, of course, I was a kid, in the 60s, but I remember things being, pretty darn, fractured. And, we had a lot of, we had leftist domestic terrorism all over the place. We had rioting, we had all kinds of things. So I think the 60s were a pretty tumultuous time period, and the more you study history, the more you realize that everything is kind of on a continuous cycle
Mm-hmm.
that just keeps repeating. And uh, you know, people will say, "Well, this is the worst time we've ever been." Well, no, not really. I think the Civil War was pretty bad.
Yeah,
You know,
we forget
I think
about
the
that.
Civil War was pretty bad. I think the Reconstruction period was pretty bad. I think World War II was kind of a bit of a tough spot too. I mean, this is the part of human nature, I think, where human beings seem to think that everything that's happening at that moment in their world is the worst
Mm-hmm.
or the best, and it's neither. And
Part of this
like
animosity is 100% the fault of the media, also, because they have their own political, skew, and so they're covering stories in a way that the people that agree with them and their audience, will enjoy the story. So that's part of the issue. You're right. I think politics were. I'm not. I didn't live in the '60s, but I
mhm.
grew up knowing about it, reading about the Weathermen or Weathermen Underground or something like
Weather
that.
Underground, the
Weather Underground.
SDS,
Yeah, they planted a bomb in like the Capitol building and stuff like that.
yeah,
Like these are things
Black
that
Gorilla
happen.
family, yeah, all that stuff. Oh
People
yeah,
people forget about that. I guess the worst time it's ever been. It's like, well, like you said, there's been other moments in
yeah,
history where it's been pretty bad. I also see where people are like, hey, these federal agencies are kind of overstepping, or they look at it and see and go, hey, these investigations or these prosecutions and whatever. Obviously, with Trump being indicted this week and everything like that, people are looking at it going, hey, this is a one-sided kind of deal. We're focusing on people within one political spectrum. Like, hey, they're really pushing down on the conservatives right now. Anything that they can do, they're trying to
hmm
do that. What does that do? That kind of national animosity towards law enforcement, and we're kind of losing. A lot of people are losing faith and thinking that that law enforcement agencies are really independent and really doing the right thing for the country and the average citizen. A lot of that is due to leadership and how they're running their agencies. What does that do to the foot guy, the investigator out there on the street, the FBI guy that's just trying to do right by his department, his community? He's doing the right
right.
thing. He's investigating the right people, but then he sees, leadership or whatever that's driving these narratives or creating animosity that, makes it harder for them to do their job.
It's it creates um, it creates embarrassment, anxiety. It creates lethargy, all of the above. It's kind of that, but it's not new. It's not. It's also something that's kind of part of the human condition,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that it's something that has been with us a very long time, and it will probably um, you know uh, continue on, after we're dust. Uh, you know, you read about the politics of the 1880s in Tombstone,
Mm-hmm.
you know, or the Civil War, or the post-revolutionary government in the United States, and all these things. It was all full of acrimony and all kinds of really outrageous things happening. So a lot of, I mean, and law enforcement has been there in some way or another, doing their thing and kind of muddling through. I've been involved in investigations that were political in nature, and I, one in particular that I know was probably a witch hunt that was designed to politically damage the target of the investigation. And my investigation revealed no wrongdoing by that individual.
Mm-hmm.
But I follow the evidence where it leads me. I'm not gonna. It's not up to me to make those decisions. It's up to me to follow the evidence and see where it takes me. If it had led me to a different conclusion, then I would have reported that.
It's unfortunate. Like you talk about possibly being involved in what could be perceived as a witch hunt. the reality is, and I hear more and more people use this phrase. It's funny. It's been around for a while, but more and more people are using this phrase that the process is the punishment. And that's the case a lot of times, because it's easy to say, oh, well, this guy was, and I'm not talking about Trump or whatever in general. Hey, this guy was indicted, and now he got a lawyer, and then and then he got off. He was found not guilty a year later. Well, for a year, that dude is assumed guilty, or not. He's supposed to be assumed innocent, but by the media and whatever, most of the times they're like, well, he wasn't arrested for no reason. There's something to this. And then the legal cost of maintaining, having a lawyer that can not only just have a lawyer, but a lawyer that can face the federal government or face something like that. Yeah, so the process is the punishment. I can see. I don't know. It's just that's so weird, man. Like if you have that situation where you're like, hey, this feels like political, like this is a political hit on someone, or this is like a witch hunt. You as an individual within a department, if it seems questionable, what are your like recourses for that? What can you do? I mean, obviously they have like what do they call whistleblower complaints and stuff like that. Is that really it, or is there other ways you could be like, hey, this doesn't feel right,
Well, in that particular investigation, it wasn't apparent at first. It took a little time to flesh out what was really going on, and but by that point in time, wrongdoing had been discovered in the investigation on the part of other individuals, and so the investigation morphed into something else and moved on to a different target set, and there was nothing really that I could do as a special agent, because I was actually reporting to the very top of the organization. There was nothing I could do at my end to mitigate this, because I basically, my job is to be a fact finder, an unbiased fact finder, and that's what I'm reporting. And I can be Tom. Okay, I just got the name of the individual we talked about earlier from Angaco. I have his name, so I'll share that with you.
Okay.
Anyway, I'm more effective if I don't jump up and down and say, this is bullshit, I know what you guys are doing, blah, 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 blah. Because basically, I might as well just put a gun to my head and blow my brains out, because I've just committed political suicide or career suicide. I think it's far more effective to present the facts of the case, and make it clear that I'm the fact finder. I'm the one you sent out to do this, and I'm not finding anything. And let them deal with that, and let them deal with that reality.
Yeah.
So
it's such a weird, I mean, I have like I said before, I have friends that are in local law enforcement. I've asked them that before, like, hey, if you were called to do something that you felt was unconstitutional, is there a way to report that, or an out, what is the process? And it's kind of, there's no real, I've never gotten like a real kind of answer for it, other than like, hey, there's like the whistleblower. If you think it's something so egregious, you can, become a whistleblower. But it's like one of those, like you said, you do that, you become a whistleblower, you're basically committing career suicide. Even if they say, hey, there's whistleblower protections, there's this and that. Well, cool. A year from now, no one's going to know who you are. And those reports are very easily to go, hey, this guy hasn't been performing.
Well, according to the FBI agents who are whistleblowers now, they've been sanctioned, and all kinds of things have happened to them. Yeah. And theoretically, that's not supposed to happen. But who knows? Once again, the devil's always in the details.
I just saw that there was a congressional hearing like a week or two ago, where 3 of them, they were saying that promotions had been put on hold, or like they were moved to a different area, to a different jurisdiction or whatever, different office, and then once they moved to that area, they were basically put on like unpaid leave, and it was like, what do you do? Again, the process is a punishment, right?
The number one rule in the Bureau, as I have been told by many, many agents from the Bureau, and I actually watched somebody say that during an interview on a 2020, one of those murder of the week things. Never, ever embarrass the Bureau. Never embarrass the Bureau. Rule number 1, rule number 2, and rule number 3, see rule number 1.
Yeah,
So,
but that's cool and all until it starts becoming an issue, and
well,
that's where
well,
that's where a lot of people are getting. They're like this. We feel like investigations are lopsided, or well, let's
right.
talk. Let's kind of shift a little bit. I mean, you worked on
Uh-huh.
this joint task or joint
Terrorism
terrorism
task.
task force. Excuse me,
Right.
a little tongue twister for a second.
Huh.
How do you guys identify like this is terrorism? Because again, this has been in the news lately where they were talking about, parents being upset at school board meetings. We're starting to get like profiles built on them and stuff like that. Domestic terrorism. How do you define that? How do you get into the crosshairs of the FBI, as a possible domestic terrorist?
Well, I can't comment on what goes on now. I know that uh, terrorism is the use of violence or the threat of violence to impact government process and population. And if it's domestic, then it's organized and perpetrated by persons living within the United States. Generally speaking, I mean, it's far more complex than that, but that's kind of sort of what it is. You know, um, it is something that the lawyers at the Justice Department decide when they evaluate the facts of an investigation or a case. Then they look at it and they go, okay, this is terrorism, this isn't terrorism, that kind of thing. I can think of a couple of instances where that happened. The Fort Hood shooter. This is a guy who was Nadal Hassan, Major Nadal Hassan. He's a guy who clearly was following the teachings of an Islamist leader, and in communication and all kinds of things going on there. And I don't know all the facts of the case, but if it has web feet, feathers, and quacks like a duck and tastes good with orange sauce, it's a duck. So chances are this guy, was a terrorist. But it took a long time for the government to say that. And in fact, initially the case was characterized for months and months as workplace violence.
Mm-hmm.
Which really it wasn't. Anybody who knew anything about it knew that wasn't the case. And there was an incident on July 4th, 2002 in Los Angeles, where an individual, Egyptian-born individual, went up to the El Al counter at LAX and started capping rounds off and killed some people. And an El Al security employee capped him, and then that was it. And for the longest period of time, nobody would classify that as an act of terror. In fact, I was a task force commander for the Department of Justice counter-terrorism task force, and I'm talking to FBI supervisors about this incident, and I'm saying, okay, so what are we calling this? And I said, are you guys going to call this an act of terrorism? And no, we're going to do that. And I'm like, okay,
Yeah,
well,
what's
we
the
know some facts
hesitation?
about this. I mean, this kind of smells like that pretty clearly. There are all kinds of ramifications, political, economic, cultural, when something is declared an act of terror. There's obviously all kinds of things that happen, especially in the airline industry, affecting a public airline industry or the hotel industry or something like that. But at some point in time, we have to be honest with the public, so the public is aware that is out there, and you have to, you need to make sure that the public knows that terrorism is the reason for this particular incident and not something else. So I understand that people want to have their ducks in a row before they declare it something, but at a certain point in time, everybody knows
Mm-hmm.
what the real deal is, and it doesn't take months and months to figure it out.
Yeah, that kind of, when you see that, I mean, I remember the Nadal Hassan case and that going down, and then everyone like, workplace violence. What are you talking about? Like, this is obviously
Right.
terrorism.
Exactly.
I don't understand the hesitation when it's something like that where it's so obvious, because all you're doing is eroding trust in the public. Because I'm going to look at that and go, what kind of morons are working here, or what kind of activists are working here to try to, you know, change the story from reality. And that's the frustration I think a lot of people have. So it's so crazy. I mean, it sucks that the first thing you mentioned was the considerations was politics. You know, that's
Well,
like,
that's exactly what that is what it is. The consideration is politics. You know, uh, uh, Benghazi. Benghazi was, remember Benghazi? That was right before an election.
mm-hmm.
Benghazi was a demonstration that got out of hand. Remember
Oh
that?
yeah,
That was declared a demonstration that got out of hand.
I remember
Uh,
that.
well, not so much. It really kind of wasn't that,
Not
you
too many
know.
riots bring mortars
No.
along with them.
Well, yeah, and lots of them, and
Yeah.
lots of bad guys with you know, Kalashnikovs. That's you know, there's happy fire, and then there's, like, you know, an attack on a compound. You know.
Yeah, it's such a crazy. That's so crazy, though. Are there any domestic cases that you can walk us through that you were a part of? You can kind of explain so we can better understand like the process.
Uh, yes. I have to speak in general terms. I'm going to speak about cases that specifically my task force handled. Um, that there were cases that or bits of intelligence. Let me start by saying that intelligence came to us through sources indicating that there was recruitment going on in the prison systems by Muslim fundamentalist clerics, and we investigated it, and we determined that it was probably pretty credible. And we prepared a briefing, and I shared that with my counterparts at the Joint Terrorism Task Force. And this was in early 2002, I think. I can't remember exactly, but it was early on, post 9/11, pretty early on. And I was basically met with incredulity. You know, why would they do that? That doesn't make any sense, blah, 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 blah. And I'm thinking to myself, well, actually, yeah, from an operational standpoint, it makes a hell of a lot of sense. You got disgruntled people in prison who have U.S. passports and U.S. citizens. They understand the language. They understand the culture. They can move freely through society. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And I believe there is something in the quote-unquote Al-Qaeda manual talking about recruiting the brothers in the prison system. So, you know, and what our focus was on the task force that I commanded was the development of target packages, basically what you guys would call target packages, which was taking intelligence and developing it to a point where it's actionable, and then handing it off to an investigative enforcement group who would actually take it to the next level, execute search warrants, surveillances, all those things, and arrests and prosecutions and things like that. That's what we did. And we had another investigation where we developed information on an individual who had ordered an unusually high amount of fertilizer. And it was way more than he'd ever ordered before. He was an individual who was in a very unique and interesting position in California, and was had some interesting travel patterns. Let me put it to you that way. Some very interesting travel patterns. And we prepared that investigation and handed it off, and we were supposed to work it jointly. And a case agent called. We were supposed to conduct a face-to-face interview with the suspect over this, and a case agent contacted the guy's wife by phone, and she called. She said, of course, she said he ain't here, and then she called him, and he called the agent back, and the agent conducted an interview over the phone and said, "Oh, there's nothing here." So, you know, those are the kinds of things that that happen. We were involved in funding of basically what we believe to have been Hezbollah, people related to Hezbollah, through the cigarette tax, stamp avoidance, and selling cigarettes without stamps, immigration fraud. We were aware of and developed information on training facilities in different places that were being utilized by fundamentalist groups with ties to overseas.
In the U.S., you're talking about training?
In the United States, yeah.
I think I had heard, I don't know if this is the same one, but I remember reading about something like that in the news like a year or two ago, like in Arizona or something like that. They had these like compounds almost that they're out there running little camps. I don't know.
Oh, yeah. They're and I'm sure it's not gone away because there's no reason for it to.
Well, I would hope the reason is that the FBI is going to come arrest them, you know?
Yeah, there is that, isn't there?
Yeah, that should be the case, but...
Yeah, well, anyway, and that's not the agent's faults. That's not the agent's faults. That is political considerations coming from higher.
So you guys can't do anything unless like the attorney general or district attorneys or whoever says, "Hey, we're going to go after this." Like you can just present some information, but it's up to them if they even want to pursue it, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, as state officers, we could pursue it on our side, and we did. But when we would develop stuff and hand it off to our federal partners, it was up to them to run it through their chain of command and their legal to see if it passed all of the tests to open an inquiry or a full field investigation or whatever, an intelligence investigation or whatever. And that's sort of how the process works. There's a difference in that, there's far less bureaucracy. For me, an agent would come to me and said, "Hey, we got this guy corner walk and don't walk, and blah 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 blah." I'd say, "Yeah, let's go run with it. Let's go see let's maybe do some surveillance or whatever." On the federal side, there's a lot of approvals that have to happen and things like that. They're not as quick to react. They can't react as quickly because they have more levels of bureaucracy and legal oversight that they have to satisfy.
Which is also a mechanism to protect the individuals, the average citizen, right? The federal government shouldn't just be able to come into a state jurisdiction and start doing investigations without at least, at a minimum, probably informing the state or whatever. I don't know how all that works.
Well, they do that all the time, though.
Yeah,
they really don't have. I mean, in a perfect world, local law enforcement always complains about the bureau or whoever not telling them everything. Well, there's a reason why the bureau doesn't do that, and it's a good reason. And so, so I completely support and understand that, absolutely 110%. But there's also a need to know. And if you have a need to know, a demonstrable need to know, and then you need to know. Then there are certain things that need to be shared. But you also have to be vetted properly. Yeah. You have to be willing to submit yourself to a security clearance investigation, so you can be trusted with this sensitive information. Because most of this stuff, everything that they're working on is going to be classified at some level almost. And you can't just share that with everybody. Yeah. You got to be, obviously you have to be very careful with it. So I totally understand, that side of the other side of the equation too. In
the military, I'm a firm believer that we overclassify a lot of stuff. I think it's overclassification is a little ridiculous at sometimes. Is it like that in law enforcement? Do you feel like things are overclassified sometimes, or do you feel like most agencies that you've worked with do a pretty good job of trying to be transparent with the general public when they're requesting information or whatever?
Well, first off, there's no levels of classification really in the classic sense that most people think of on the local side. It all occurs on the federal side for the most part. And so, and you have different levels, confidential and, I can't remember, obviously secret, top secret, SC, all that stuff. And so yes, there is through FOIA and things like that, there are mechanisms in place for private citizens to get access to information on the state side, on the local side, pretty easily. On the federal side, it's much more complicated because frequently the information is far more sensitive, protecting sources and methods and all kinds of things. National security is a real thing, and it does trump many other factors, and it should. It really should.
I think you're right, as long as it's legitimately being classified because of national
Right.
security reasons and not for
Well,
political coverage.
when I was in Iraq, I worked with Army Intel officer, and that's one of the things he complained about, that they just overclassify too much shit. And I firsthand was involved in one of those things where they had taken something I had written that was a white paper that was completely unclassed, and they classified it. And he's like, okay, this is bullshit. This should not be classified.
The Intel world's an interesting world because they have access to all the raw intelligence, and they have more background information on different things. It's got to be tough to be one of those Intel guys that are reading some of these reports that are coming through that they feel like, hey, this is an actionable whatever, this is a important thing that we should be taking care of, but there's no desire within the organization to pursue that. You know what I'm saying? Because there's obviously resource management. You only have so many people that can
Correct.
work on these different things. There's only so much time in the day, kind of deal. But it has to be frustrating to see things go by the wayside that you're like, what? Like, why didn't we take, that's a weird world I've actually had Intel people tell me that they're okay with getting out of intelligence because they don't want to see some of the stuff that slips by just because there's not the resources to cover it, or there's not the desire to cover whatever it is. You know what I'm saying?
That's accurate. That is an accurate statement. That is absolutely accurate. And I used to say that the next 9/11 is probably sitting on some agent's desk somewhere, just like the last 9/11 was, because collecting intelligence is one thing, but analysis is the critical element in intelligence. You have nothing if you just have words and noise without proper analysis, linking the dots, what does all of this make? What does this mean? This all may make a very good. An old boss of mine used to say to me, he'd say, "Well, this may make a very good book one day, but what does it mean?"
Mm-hmm.
And that's really true. What does it mean? And, one of the things that we had on my task force, because I came from an agency that had a very, very robust counter-narcotics unit, and we relied heavily on intelligence analysis. My little task force of like 13 investigators, we had 3 intelligence analysts. And I also had access to probably 24 more intelligence analysts at my fingertips if I needed that. And I can tell you for sure that my counterparts at the Bureau did not have that access like we had. We had them embedded with us. We spent our time together with them. And that's another thing that's a critical element is the intelligence analysts being embedded with the collectors, because then it's easier to task, and it's easier to kind of make sense of things, because a lot of stuff happens. A lot of cases get solved over lunch, over coffee.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of cases do, because they go, "Oh yeah, I know that guy. I remember I arrested that guy 3 years ago. Let me tell you a little bit about him." Blah 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 blah. Before you know it, you got a case solved. And it's the same thing. It's the same thing on this side too. The Joint Terrorism Task Force I started in 1999. And I left the task force in 2008 when I went to Iraq as an embedded advisor. And the transformation that took place in 2002 was astounding. We went from the Joint Terrorism Task Force went from kind of a dysfunctional organization to an absolutely fabulous place to work with motivated, wonderful agents, information sharing there was no games played. Everybody was on the same team. You couldn't tell the locals from the FBI agents. I mean, it was fabulous. It was a wonderful place to work, and the agents I worked with were some of the best people I've ever met in my life. And I mean that sincerely. The supervisors, the agents, but what happened is they needed to shed the old bureau and morph to a new world that had to be more inclusive with local law enforcement. And they did that, to their credit. They absolutely did that. And it became a fabulous situation. And I actually was able to bring over some of my agents and analysts and embed them in the task force also. So we had people embedded in the Joint Terrorism Task Forces throughout California, and we had intelligence analysts embedded with them too, and which allowed them to seamlessly draw on state databases and records that they would not easily have access to on the federal side, or even be aware of on the federal side. We could do things they couldn't do. They can do things we couldn't do, but we could do things they couldn't do. So working together, we became quite formidable.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the ideal situation. And I hope it still is that case. I don't know, because like I said, I've been out of it a long time now. But back then, it was really a fabulous. After that change occurred, it became a really amazing place to work, and it was fabulous and a very, very collegiate atmosphere.
Yeah, I think 9/11 really stopped a lot of the stovepiping of information that was happening. You know, it's like, I'm working on this specific thing. I don't want to let it out because who knows who might, this might leak out to the wrong person or whatever.
Right.
But I think it showed people like, hey, you have to have more trust in your fellow agencies, that we're all on the same team kind of here. Yeah,
Absolutely.
You might run into an issue where there's like a mole or an insider or something like that finds out some information, but is the threat so high that we can't share anything with anyone? I think we realized that was a bad way to do business. From that time frame, from 9/11 up until you left and went on to do the military contract or the advising stuff, was it just major? Did you feel like there was major improvements happening within law enforcement in general?
110%. Because prior to 9/11, intelligence was also on the local side, was frequently one of those units that was sort of put in a corner or a closet and not really considered important. Now, on the narcotics side of the equation, it was. But, historically, an agency would maybe have one detective working intelligence stuff, or maybe two, but usually not super aggressively, like we did, on the state level and at the federal level, because there really wasn't an understanding until until 9/11 hit. People really started waking up and realizing that the only way to prevent this stuff is intelligence collection and analysis, and also kicking their ass overseas too and killing them. But really, to keep the homeland safe, you need effective intelligence collection and analysis, and it's super critical, super critical.
So what made you decide to leave law enforcement as a profession, the actual agencies, and move over into this advisor role working with the military overseas?
Well, I was retirement age when that happened. And I decided that, and I was looking for another thing to do. I could retire, start collecting my pension, and then, as we call, double dip.
Yeah.
And so that's what I did. And this gig was an opportunity for me, who had never been in the service, but had kind of grown up around that environment, but had never really been in the service, to kind of get a feel for that, and also get up close and personal with something that I've been fascinated by and studied for decades. My interest in terrorism goes back to the mid '80s, which is how I kind of got into these roles was because I was the guy who knew about. I was the guy, one of the guys that kind of knew about this stuff before it was cool to know about it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
When you go and do these, when you go and work as an advisor, were you coming as an individual augment, or did you have a small team that you guys went together? And because that's a big, for those that don't know, if you're even in the military, if I'm going from my unit to another unit to go work with them, there's a big difference in me going by myself and then me going with like 5 people. Because at least if I go with 5 people, I know some people. We can all work together
Yes.
to like be good at what we're doing. If you go
Oh,
by
believe me,
yourself, everyone's
it
looking at you like,
sucks.
who's this guy?
And where do you go, and where's the chow hall, and where do you get my cat card? All of the nonsense that I learned about. Yes, I experienced both, actually. Yes, we did go over. About 15 of us went over to Iraq at the same. Well, one guy went to Afghanistan, or 2 guys went to Afghanistan. The rest of us went to Iraq, and we all went to Camp Victory, and then from Camp Victory deployed to various units throughout Iraq at FOBs and other bases and things like that. I was embedded with IED defeat cell at HHC 10th Mountain Division headquarters, and
What year was this?
2008.
That's a big year for IEDs, huh?
Pardon me?
That's a big time for IEDs right there.
Yeah, especially EFPs. That was
Yeah,
really
yeah.
big deal. They were starting to run out of the artillery rounds, and they were using EFPs and things like that, and we would get the reporting on that and whatnot. And my role was to bring civilian law enforcement investigative experience and counterterrorism investigative experience to that situation. And we worked on a couple of things that one of the things that we did was wrote a paper about seizing assets, because money is the mother's milk of crime, and as you probably well know, planning bombs was kind of a money-making adventure over there. It was a venture as well, a business, as well as a tactic. And you disrupt the funding chain, and you disrupt the ability to plant bombs, because there is a chain for every bomb that's planted, and people have to get paid. And if there's no money to pay them, that obviously disrupts the operation. So my partner and myself wrote a white paper to utilize the funding of to utilize the Iraqi criminal justice system to seize assets, just like we would do in the United States, seizing assets of individuals. Same thing in Iraq. It makes total sense, and it was presumably implemented. I don't know for sure, but I believe it was. And the other thing I did was processing scenes, sniper scenes, shooting scenes. I wrote a paper on that, because I'm basically just utilizing basic investigative and evidence gathering techniques to share, and so that soldiers or military members who are at the scene of a sniper shooting or whatever, they can effectively collect the evidence that can be processed in a forensic lab in Iraq and potentially lead to the identification and neutralization of the suspect or suspects, which is very possible because we had full forensic labs over there, and we're able to do just about anything you could possibly imagine, including DNA analysis and everything else. And you can collect DNA from, discarded trash and empty shell casings and all kinds of things. And I'm going to give you a little plug here for the Marine Corps here. The Marines, I went to a class that was put on by some Marines at Victory, and it was like, wow, these guys, somebody's telling them how to do this, because you guys, they knew how to collect evidence properly.
Yeah, they started running. they started running a thing called Every Marine a Collector.
There you go.
And there was training that they would do, like, hey, this is, we gotta stop looking at this as like a whack-a-mole kind of scenario where, hey, IED, a placer pops up, hit him, or try to,
Right.
As quickly as possible, and start going for the cell that's creating the
Exactly.
IEDs, that's building the, and we do that through, like you said, the forensics. Like, hey, this dude's fingerprints have shown up on 3 different IEDs. Obviously, we need to find this who this guy is and how he's involved in this.
Exactly.
Yeah, that was I believe it was called Every Marine a Collector.
Well, I'll tell you what. Clearly, there were some, Marine reservist law enforcement guys that were involved in that training syllabus because they knew what the hell they were doing and they were talking about. And unfortunately, the Army process was get a duffel bag off of the truck and throw it in the middle of the room and pick shit up and throw it in the duffel bag. Well, that may be an effective way. That may be an effective way to clean a room of trash and garbage, but it's not a really good way to collect evidence. And
especially because you guys are taking this evidence. This isn't like, hey, we're finding evidence so we can just hellfire this guy. Some of these dudes, this evidence is being used against them in Afghan courts, Iraqi courts,
exactly.
so that country can actually prosecute them.
Exactly. The war, when I got over there, and the war had morphed, or the conflict had morphed from a war to a law enforcement, pacification kind of operation, and where the U.S. government was mandated to utilize Iraqi army and police and the justice system, and we have all of these soldiers out there. God bless them. Nobody told them how to collect evidence. They didn't get any training in that, probably, most of them. And so they're like, well, okay, well, we'll go pick up some shit over here and throw it in a bag and we're all good. And no, that's really not the best way to do it. It's not the efficient way or the correct way to do it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what that was. And actually, some of that stuff, a lot of that stuff is actually in the book and written in little bits and pieces, like the collection of evidence and that kind of thing, showing my protagonist gives a few lessons to a young soldier on the proper collection of evidence at a crime scene.
Well, let's go ahead and wrap this up. You can go ahead and promote your book. Where can people find your book? Where can people find you?
Sure. The book is called Outside the Wire, and it's a novel. The subtitle is a novel of murder, love, and war, and it truly is that. It has all 3 of those elements, and it can be found online at Amazon and Barnes & Noble. It's in a couple of other bookshops. There's one in Charlotte called Park Road Books that has it, and actually, interestingly enough, it's in London too at Hatchards on Piccadilly. Anyway, and my website is GaryEdgingtonAuthor.com, and my Instagram is at GEdgingtonBooks, and Twitter is at capital G, capital E, Edgington Books also, nice. Which I don't really have much time for Twitter, so I don't like,
it's a cesspool.
I don't really. Yeah, I don't know.
You have to have good impulse control to be on Twitter, because if not, you just get enraged by things you see. People, like, what, and you become one of those
Well, you have these keyboard warriors who, who probably weigh 15 pounds dripping wet, but are very, very brave when they're looking at a computer screen and a keyboard, calling you bad names and saying bad things.
Yeah, 100%. I'm on there a lot, but it's mostly to gather news, and I've done a pretty good job of tailoring my feed to mostly be like stuff I want to see and not the noise is what I call it. Too many people get wrapped up in all the noise that's out there of just stuff that people are trying to get them enraged by BS or, whatever.
Exactly.
But that's awesome, man.
Yeah.
What advice would you have for maybe there's some independent authors out there, military guys get out, a lot of them write books and stuff. What advice would you have for somebody that may be trying to write a book like you did?
You're in for a long haul. It's a tough thing. And don't take it to market until you know it's the best possible product it can be. Don't half-ass it. I've seen too many too many works go out that were half-assed, especially if they were self-published, and you know. Reviews are critical, super important. I'm blessed to have some fantastic reviews on Goodreads and Amazon, and they're really important. And networking and all these things that I'm not particularly good at, i.e. social media, and that kind of thing. You got to kind of come out of your comfort zone. Self-promotion, I was never very good at that. And now I find I have to kind of bloviate about myself more than I'm used to doing. And
it's like the opposite of what you learn in a field like law enforcement or military. Like no one wants you to self-promote and tell us how awesome you are. But
yeah, exactly.
In this world, you have to.
Exactly, and especially in the world that I worked in for quite some time, in the intelligence and counterterrorism world, it's not something that I really shared a lot with a lot of people. And now, that's something that I have to utilize as a something that kind of indicates that I have some minimal credibility in this world that I've written about. And I'm working on the second book. That's another thing you need to do, is start planning the second book while you're writing the first book. My second book is about a third of the way through. It's a sequel. It takes place a couple of years after, with many of the same characters that populated the first book, and it will not take place overseas. It will primarily take place in the United States, and it's something that I enjoy. I enjoy the process of writing a great deal. I really enjoy writing scenes and then afterwards going, wow, I can't believe I just did that. That was pretty damn good. Or being horrified and going back and fixing it.
I would never release this to the public.
Yeah.
What was I thinking?
But, what's really interesting about the writing process is you write, and then you go to bed and you think to yourself, oh my God, that was shit that I wrote. It was just terrible. I know it's going to be awful. And the next day or a couple days later, you go back and read it and go, oh, you know what? Really wasn't that bad.
Mm-hmm.
I can just tweak it a little bit here, a little bit there. And now with computers, it's not like I'm having to write this out in longhand on a legal pad. I can, move things around, change chapters, do word searches, pull words, all these things that you can do with a computer. You can do. So, it really, we're pretty lucky in that sense.
Now you can have AI help write the book for you.
Well, exactly. There is that. I'm not sure how to do that. I can't even spell AI, but
I wonder what. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say one other thing is writers write. And my wife told me that. She beat me over the head many times. She said, if you really want to be a writer, you better get your ass in there and start writing some more.
Mm-hmm.
And she was right, and that's really true. But when you finish that first book and you write the end, which, by the way, will generally, at least it's not in my book, and I'm guessing it probably isn't in a lot of books, that whole, the little two words, the end, it's one of the most rewarding experiences you'll ever have. And it's something that you will never forget. You'll remember where it happened and what led to it and everything else, because it was, at least for me, it was such an exciting, exhilarating thing. But then the work begins. The work really begins. That's when the promotion, of the book, like right now, and all these other things, and
all the business of it, the business of art.
And the massaging it and the rewrites, multiple, you're going to have to go through multiple versions of your manuscript and oversight and everything else. So, but
I agree with your wife. It's like we were talking about, I think we were talking about before we actually started recording, how, when I first got out, I was doing photography, and I told myself, like, dude, if you want to be a photographer, then you have to be a photographer. That means 8 hours a day. It's easy to go, oh, I'm going to be a writer. And in your mind, you're like, oh, sit at the coffee shop or by the beach and write and think, right. And, it'll be amazing. That's not the reality at all. The reality is it's work, and you have to look at it like a regular job. Like, here are my hours that I'm working on from this time to this time. And, I got it to a point where when I was doing photography, I was like, normally I would like watch YouTube videos or have a podcast on or something while I'm doing editing or something like that. And I had to switch my mindset where I was like, okay, you can watch YouTube, but it has to do with photography, or it has to do with an editing process that you're unfamiliar with. So that way you're just honing the skill. Because if you're telling yourself, I want to be this, whatever it is, I want to be a horseshoe maker, or I want to be whatever, then you have to be that thing. You can't just say, I want to be it, and it exists. It happens. It's not the way it works. It's a lot of work creating your own thing, you know?
There's a great little book out there called The War of Art by Stephen Pressfield, who I believe is a former Marine, and who wrote Gates of Fire, one of my all-time favorite books. Classic, amazing book, great writer, a hero of mine. And it's a wonderful book, and he goes through his process. He treats it. He has a rhythm, and everything is familiar to him. He sits down. He has a set amount of time he's going to work, and then he knows that he's going to dry up after that, and it's just going to be forcing. So, but it's a great little book. It's like 120 pages or whatever, and I encourage anybody who's thinking of embarking on this road to read that book, because once again, it's called The War of Art by Stephen Pressfield.
I'll have to check that out. Hey, Gary, this has been a great conversation. I really appreciate you coming on, man. We've talked about all kinds of stuff. We've been all over the place.
I know. It's amazing. And, I got to tell you something. It's such an honor to be on this show. When I heard from you, I was aware of, well aware of you.
Oh, really?
Your podcast. Oh, gosh, yes, absolutely. And
I'm just a small fish in the podcast world.
Oh, no, but you have had some giants on your show, sir. Some giants. And that really was like, I was like, oh my God, I was like so excited when I got that message from you. I was like blown away. I was like,
that's awesome.
God, this is so cool.
It's weird it's weird that a message from me would have that effect on somebody.
Well, it really did. I'll tell you what. I was with one of my old buddies from the Joint Terrorism Task Force. As a matter of fact, he was a witness.
Oh, really?
So yeah. So
that's cool, man.
Anyway,
for the people on the outside looking in, I know, like, I don't know. The podcast has been going for like almost 5 years now. 2018, August of 2018 is when the first episode came out.
Right.
But to me, it's just such a small, like, I don't know. It just doesn't feel. It's not big enough for me right now. I still think I'm like, what am I doing? I'm slacking. I'm not having the impact, or not necessarily an impact. I'm not spreading the stories like I would like to. It's like when I turn this off, I'm still sitting. This is my living room. I'm sitting in front of my living room, in front of my computer. I got a couple lights and stuff, but it's just, I don't know. It's weird for me hearing that from someone else, because you don't think that I'm sure if someone reads your book and they reach out to you and go, man, that was amazing. Like that was, exactly what I needed or whatever. It's such a good feeling to hear that. So I really appreciate that. And it's not something that I'm not cognizant of, I guess. I don't really consider that.
Well, you should be, because it's pretty impressive. When I started looking at your show and the people you've had on, I was like, wow, this is huge.
I'm just lucky. I'm just lucky that those people will take the time of their day to come on and, share their stories and stuff like that. So it's more my pleasure than it is for them, I hope.
Yeah. Well,
so
it's been a huge pleasure for me, I assure you.
Good, man. Everybody can check out my stuff. My website's jkramergraphics.com. I am doing more digital marketing stuff. I don't really have any of the services on the website, but if you're interested in search engine optimization, stuff like that, feel free to reach out to me. My Anglico homies, anglicoshop.com. Check that out. My Instagram's @FormerActionGuys, @FormerActionNews, both of those. And that's it, man. This is a good time.
Roger that.